Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at a real historical event, one that military historians still consider among the most audacious acts of individual survival in the entire Second World War. It involves a shot-down American pilot, 16 months inside a German prison camp, and a stolen enemy aircraft. This is not a Hollywood story. Every detail you are about to hear is documented and verified. Let's begin. February 9, 1944. The time is 3:47 in the afternoon. 20 miles off the southern coast of France, in the freezing waters of the Mediterranean Sea, a 22-year-old American pilot named Robert Anderson Hoover is fighting to stay alive. Blood from shrapnel wounds seeps through his flight suit. His parachute has tangled around his legs, pulling him beneath the surface. Above him, the wreckage of his Supermarine Spitfire disappears into the dark water. He has no rescue beacon. His squadron has not seen him. According to military medical estimates, he has approximately 4 hours before hypothermia kills him. Hoover was flying with the 4th Fighter Squadron, 52nd Fighter Group, based in Sicily. February 9th was his 59th combat mission, a number well above the average for pilots in his theater. The mission was a standard fighter sweep over Nice, an area of active German air defense in early 1944. He was flying a Spitfire Mark V, an aircraft that had been reporting mechanical problems since the moment it left the runway that morning. At some point during the patrol, 4 Focke-Wulf FW-190s intercepted his flight. The ambush was swift and professional. The FW-190 was one of the finest fighter aircraft Germany produced during the war, fast, heavily armed, and flown by experienced pilots who knew exactly how to use it. Hoover's malfunctioning engine could not deliver the power he needed to respond. Within minutes, 20mm cannon shells tore through his cockpit. His Spitfire became unflyable. He pulled the canopy release and bailed out at 8,000 feet. As he descended, he watched his wingman, Flight Officer Hugh Montgomery, spiral downward in flames. A second pilot in his flight, Lieutenant Bishop, also fell to German guns that afternoon. 3 American aircraft were destroyed within minutes over the Mediterranean. The German merchant vessel that pulled Hoover from the water did so as the sun was setting. He had been in the sea for approximately 30 minutes. He was wounded, hypothermic, and wearing a prison camp uniform before he even knew he was going to one. Within days, he was processed and transferred north, toward Germany, toward a camp on the Baltic coast that held more Allied airmen than any other facility in the Reich. The next phase of his war was about to begin. By early 1944, the numbers behind the Allied air campaign were ones that military planners preferred not to publicize. For every 1,000 American and British aircrew sent into combat over Europe, 511 died on operations. 130 became prisoners of war. 120 were killed or seriously wounded in non-combat accidents. Only 240 men in every 1,000 completed their tours unharmed. These were not projections. They were actuarial tables, updated weekly. The air war over Europe consumed men at a rate that rivaled the worst infantry engagements of the First World War, except that these were highly trained, expensively educated technicians. Each American bomber crew required approximately a year of specialized training before it was considered combat ready. Losing them was not only a human tragedy, it was a logistical problem with no easy solution. The prisoners, those who survived, entered a parallel war, fought not with aircraft, but with patience and hunger. By 1944, Germany held over 80,000 Allied prisoners of war. A significant portion of them were airmen, and the primary facility for captured Allied flyers was Stalag Luft I, located near the town of Barth on the Baltic Sea coast of northern Germany. By then, it had expanded significantly, surrounded by double rows of 10-foot barbed wire fences and watchtowers staffed by guards with standing orders to fire on any prisoner who crossed the inner warning wire. The camp operated under the Geneva Convention in theory. In practice, men survived on watery soup, black bread, and Red Cross parcels that arrived irregularly and were sometimes confiscated before distribution. Dysentery moved through the barracks. Pneumonia was a constant threat during the Baltic winters. The psychological condition of the prisoners was in some ways harder to measure than their physical state, but no less damaging. These were men in their early 20s who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments the Allied military offered. They had trained for years, and now they sat behind wire, watching the sky, knowing that other men were dying in it while they could do nothing. The combination of helplessness, boredom, and fear created a pressure that no amount of military training had prepared them for. Escape attempts were constant. The camp's escape committee, a formal, organized body of over 200 prisoners, coordinated tunnel operations, document forgery, uniform manufacturing, and the gathering of intelligence on guard routines and fence vulnerabilities. The results were almost uniformly discouraging. Switzerland was 300 miles south through Nazi-controlled territory. Sweden required crossing the Baltic Sea. Spain meant traversing the entire length of France. For Bob Hoover, newly arrived and still recovering from his wounds, this was the environment he would inhabit for the next 16 months. He would attempt to escape 24 times. He would spend more days in solitary confinement than any other prisoner in the camp. And somewhere in those long months, he would form a plan so improbable that the camp's own escape committee estimated his chances of success at 2%. He was going to steal a German aircraft and fly out. Robert Anderson Hoover was born on January 24, 1922, in Nashville, Tennessee. Nothing about his background suggested that he would one day become what General Jimmy Doolittle later called the greatest stick and rudder pilot who ever lived. His family had no military connections. His father was not a pilot. There was no money for flying lessons, no private airstrip in the backyard, no early access to the world of aviation that defined his generation's heroes. What Hoover had, from a very early age, was a specific and unrelenting preoccupation with flight. He began working odd jobs at the age of 15, washing aircraft, sweeping hangar floors, running errands for mechanics, in exchange for flight time. His early instructors noted something that went beyond enthusiasm. Hoover flew at the edges of every envelope his instructors defined, not out of recklessness, but out of a need to understand exactly how far a machine would go before it stopped cooperating. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Hoover was 19 years old and working as a grocery store clerk in Nashville. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces within days. The selection board saw a young man with some private flight time and no formal academic credentials, no college degree, no engineering training. They assigned him to ferry duty, moving aircraft between bases across North Africa. It was useful work, but a significant distance from combat. Between December 1942 and August 1943, Hoover flew ferry assignments for the 12th Air Force, logging hundreds of hours in a wide variety of aircraft, from transports to medium bombers. He used the time strategically. He studied every pilot he met. He asked questions about tactics, about enemy aircraft, about the mechanics of air-to-air combat. He also made formal and informal requests for a combat assignment. He wanted to be a fighter pilot. In September 1943, the 52nd Fighter Group in Sicily needed replacement pilots. Hoover's persistence, combined with his accumulated flight hours, finally produced results. He was assigned to the 4th Fighter Squadron, flying Spitfires over France and Italy. His commanding officer later described him as a pilot who needed to be in the center of every engagement, not out of ego, but out of a genuine compulsion to be exactly where the action was most intense. Hoover flew 58 successful combat missions before February 9, 1944. He flew convoy escorts, bomber protection details, and offensive fighter sweeps. He became known as a pilot whose aircraft always seemed to come back, no matter what condition it left in. Then came Mission 59, and the FW-190s over Nice, and the Mediterranean Sea at sunset. The combat career that had seemed invincible ended with shrapnel wounds and 30 minutes of freezing water. Inside Stalag Luft 1, Hoover's frustration found an outlet in escape planning almost immediately. He attempted to escape once, then again, then again. His methods were varied: tunnels, uniform disguises, attempts to slip through perimeter gaps during shift changes. The German guards learned his face. He spent weeks in solitary confinement on reduced rations. None of it stopped him. By spring 1945, he had attempted escape 24 times, the most persistent escapee in the camp's history. The encounter that would change his approach happened in mid-1944, when Hoover met Major Gustav Edward Lundquist. Before being shot down, Lundquist had been an accomplished test pilot with highly relevant experience. He had flown captured FW-190s in England as part of an Allied intelligence program designed to study German aircraft performance and vulnerability. He knew the Focke-Wulf intimately. He knew where every switch was, what every gauge measured, how the aircraft behaved at takeoff, in turns, and at low altitude. Lundquist's offer to Hoover was simple and completely without practical basis. He would teach him to fly the FW-190, not in an actual aircraft. There were none. He would teach him by drawing the cockpit in the dirt of the prison compound, by tracing control layouts from memory, and by describing the aircraft's handling characteristics with the precision of a man who had spent hours behind its controls. He described the machine in enough detail that a prepared pilot might actually fly it. "The stick is heavier than a Spitfire's," Lundquist told him. "The torque on takeoff will try to pull you left. Counter it immediately with right rudder. The engine runs hot. Watch the coolant temperature constantly." Other prisoners considered this organized delusion. He would have no radio, no maps, no parachute. Flying in enemy markings was technically a war crime. If the Germans caught him in the act, he could be executed. Hoover listened to every objection, acknowledged each one, and went back to memorizing the startup sequence. Night after night, in the limited light of the barracks, he closed his eyes and ran through the checklist. Fuel selector valve, battery switch, magneto settings, primer, starter engage. He did it until the sequence was not something he had to think about, until it was something his hands would do automatically, the way they had done with the Spitfire after hundreds of hours in the cockpit. He was preparing for a flight he had never taken, in an aircraft he had never touched. The camp's escape committee reviewed his plan formally. Their assessment was direct. The probability of success was less than 2%. The probability of being killed, by Allied fire, by German anti-aircraft batteries, by a takeoff accident in an aircraft he had never flown, was extremely high. They advised against it. Hoover noted the advice and continued his ground school. He had been preparing for 16 months. He was not going to stop now. By the spring of 1945, the military situation across Europe had shifted in ways that were visible even from inside Stalag Luft 1. Soviet artillery could be heard to the east, a low, continuous rumble that grew louder with each passing week. German guards began disappearing. Vehicles moved on the roads at unusual hours. The administrative routines that had governed prison life with rigid German precision began showing gaps and irregularities. The Reich was collapsing, and the prisoners could hear it. This should have been reassuring. Allied forces were closing from the west. Soviet forces were closing from the east. General Eisenhower had issued explicit orders to all prisoner-of-war camps. Allied prisoners were to remain in place, maintain discipline, and await liberation. Escape attempts in the final weeks of the war were to cease immediately. The reasoning was sound. Liberation was imminent. Attempting escape now meant risking death within sight of freedom. But Eisenhower's order did not fully account for the specific geography and vulnerabilities of Stalag Luft I. The camp sat near the Baltic coast, directly in the path of the Soviet advance. The 7,717 American airmen imprisoned there, along with thousands of British, Canadian, and other Allied flyers, faced questions no military order could definitively answer. Would German guards execute the prisoners before retreating? What would Soviet forces do when they arrived? The men in the camp understood the uncertainty. The confrontation happened on April 29, 1945, inside a barracks at Stalag Luft I. Colonel Henry Russell Spicer, the senior Allied officer in the camp, faced a room of prisoners who had reached the end of their patience. Spicer had his orders. Eisenhower's directive was clear: no escape attempts. Wait for liberation. The room did not accept this quietly. "Someone will execute us before the Soviets arrive," one man said. Another, "The Germans are already deserting. Who controls this camp tonight?" Nobody answered. When Bob Hoover interrupted, calmly, directly, without particular emotion, Spicer listened. Hoover's point was simple. He had been in captivity for 16 months. He had attempted escape 24 times. He had memorized the cockpit of a German fighter aircraft using dirt diagrams. He was not going to wait. The question was whether he would leave with the camp administration's implicit awareness or without it. Spicer asked him to explain the plan. Hoover did. He would steal a FW-190 from a German airfield and fly it west to Allied-controlled territory. Major Lundquist confirmed the training details. The training, Lundquist acknowledged, had been conducted using sand drawings. The room processed this in silence for a moment, and then several men laughed. The specific laughter of people confronting something too absurd to dismiss and too serious to ignore. Spicer's formal position was unchanged. He could not authorize an escape attempt. What he could do, what he in fact did after a pause that witnesses would describe for decades afterward, was acknowledge that he was getting older, that his eyesight was not what it had been, and that if certain events happened during a particular distraction, he might not notice them. The plan was simple. The escape committee would stage a fight on the western side of the compound, drawing the guards' attention. During the distraction, Hoover and any volunteers would use a wooden plank hidden under a barracks to vault the perimeter fence. After that, they were on their own. No support, no prearranged contacts, no fallback position. Flight Officer Jerry Ennis, the same man who had spent months pointing out the practical impossibilities of Hoover's FW-190 plan, stepped forward immediately. He was coming. A Canadian airman also volunteered. The three men spent the remaining hours of April 29th making what preparations they could, which amounted to very little. They had no weapons beyond a small pistol that would be acquired later. No maps, no civilian clothes, no German currency, no forged documents. What they had was the approaching darkness, a wooden plank, and whatever was on the other side of the wire. Hoover reviewed Lundquist's procedures one final time, not from notes, because there were no notes, but from memory, running through the FW-190 startup sequence in his head the way a pilot runs through a checklist before starting an engine. Fuel selector, battery, magnetos, primer, starter. He had done it hundreds of times in his imagination. In a matter of hours, he would have to do it in reality, in an aircraft he had never sat inside, on a German airfield in the final days of a collapsing war. The distraction began just after dusk on April 29, 1945. On the western side of Stalag Luft I, prisoners staged a fight with the commitment of men who understood that the performance had to be convincing. Guards rushed toward the commotion, whistles blowing, voices raised in German commands. Watchtower lights swung west. For approximately 90 seconds, the eastern perimeter received less attention than it had at any point in recent memory. 90 seconds was enough. Hoover, Ennis, and the Canadian airmen moved to the predetermined barracks, pulled the wooden plank from beneath the structure, and carried it at a run to the fence line. Hoover pressed the plank against the double barbed wire fence and climbed. The wood flexed under his weight. Barbed wire caught his prison uniform and tore fabric. He did not stop. He dropped down on the far side and landed hard on German soil. Ennis followed. The Canadian came last. For the first time in 16 months, Bob Hoover stood outside the wire of Stalag Luft 1. Behind them, the distraction was unraveling. Whistles shrieked across the compound. Searchlights began their sweep. Dogs barked somewhere in the darkness to the north. The three men ran west into the tree line, staying low, moving as quickly as the darkness allowed. The sound of the camp faded behind them. The sound of Soviet artillery grew louder ahead. They found a barn on a farm approximately 2 kilometers from the camp and buried themselves in the hay. Through the night, German military vehicles moved on the road outside. Trucks, half-tracks, the mechanical sounds of an army trying to organize its retreat. They did not speak. They lay still and listened and waited for daylight. At dawn, a French woman discovered them. She was one of thousands of foreign workers conscripted into German agricultural labor, and she understood immediately what she was looking at. She spoke no English. Hoover wrote her a brief note, thanking her for her silence and asking any Allied soldiers who found her to extend her protection. She read it, nodded once, and pressed a small .25 caliber pistol into Ennis's hand. "More good for you than me," she said in broken English. It was the only weapon they would carry. They found bicycles in a nearby village and rode west into the chaos of the final days of the war. The roads of northern Germany in late April 1945 were a specific kind of chaos that had no peacetime equivalent. Retreating German military columns moved alongside columns of displaced civilians. Refugees from the east moved in the opposite direction from soldiers trying to reach defensible positions. Downed airmen on stolen bicycles were, in that particular environment, nearly invisible. Nobody had the attention to spare. The first serious problem came when they encountered advancing Soviet forces. 3 men in German prison uniforms, with no identification documents and no language in common with Soviet soldiers pointing rifles at them, were in a genuinely dangerous position. Ennis managed to communicate something useful through his limited high school French. The Soviets let them pass. They pedaled away without looking back and moved on foot and by bicycle for approximately 2 days westward. And then, on a morning when Soviet artillery had become a permanent background condition, they came over a rise in the terrain and saw it below them. A German airfield. Not a major installation, a secondary field, the kind used for dispersal and emergency operations, as Allied bombing had rendered the primary bases unusable. Most of the aircraft visible on the field were damaged, wings torn by bomb fragments, several clearly cannibalized for parts. But at the far edge of the field, sheltered in a revetment of earth and cut timber, sat a Focke-Wulf FW-190 that looked different from the others. It had bullet holes in the fuselage, but its engine cowling was intact. Its propeller was undamaged, and someone had apparently been maintaining it, because there was a German mechanic working on it as the 3 men watched from the tree line. The aircraft carried a full fuel load. Hoover could see the indicators from where he stood. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he turned to Ennis and the Canadian. "That is the aircraft," he said. Nobody argued. They waited and watched through the morning, mapping the guard positions, tracking personnel movement. By early afternoon, The mechanic working on the FW-190 was alone in his revetment. The guard posts were occupied but not alert. The three men moved down through the tree line and walked directly toward the revetment with the purposeful movement of men who belonged there. The German mechanic looked up from his work and found a pistol 2 feet from his face. He was a middle-aged man in work clothes, not a combat soldier. He raised his hands. The message was simple: help the Americans start this aircraft, or accept the consequences. The mechanic looked at the pistol, at the three men in prison uniforms, at the war visible on the horizon in every direction, and made a practical decision. He nodded. Hoover climbed into the cockpit. Hoover climbed into the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf FW-190 for the first and only time in his life. The cockpit was exactly where Lundquist had said it would be. The fuel selector valve was on the left console, positioned precisely as the sand diagrams had shown. The magneto switches were where he had memorized them. 16 months of imaginary pre-flight checks converged on this moment. His hands moved without conscious instruction. The mechanic leaned into the cockpit, pointing at specific switches and speaking in rapid French. Hoover barely needed it. Fuel selector on. Battery on. Magnetos both. Primer. Starter engaged. The BMW 801 radial engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a concussive roar that shook the revetment and sent birds scattering from the tree line 200 meters away. The sound carried across the entire airfield. German personnel began moving toward the source. Ennis was standing at the wing. Hoover looked down and made a final offer. One last invitation to climb into the aircraft and leave this way rather than on foot. Ennis shook his head. After being shot down and spending 16 months as a prisoner of war, he had made a personal decision never to fly again. It was a legitimate choice, and there was no time to debate it. German soldiers were running across the field now. Hoover pushed the throttle forward. The FW-190 lurched out of the revetment and onto the grass. There was no runway, only an open field that ended in a line of trees several hundred meters ahead. German soldiers ran alongside the aircraft, some reaching for the wingtips. Hoover applied right rudder against the torque exactly as Lundquist had described, exactly as he had practiced hundreds of times in his imagination. The aircraft tracked straight. He pushed the throttle to its stop. The trees at the end of the field were very close when he pulled back on the stick. The FW-190 left the ground with approximately 20 feet to spare. The branches of the outermost trees swept beneath the landing gear. And then he was airborne, climbing away from the field, climbing away from Germany, climbing into overcast European skies in an enemy fighter with swastikas painted on both wings. The reality of his situation assembled itself quickly. He had no parachute. He had no maps. He had a radio set to German military frequencies that he had no intention of using. He had no knowledge of Allied anti-aircraft positions, no transponder code that would identify him as friendly, and no way to communicate his identity to any pilot or gunner who acquired him as a target. He was flying a German military aircraft through actively patrolled airspace, with no way to prove he was anything other than the enemy. He climbed to 4,000 feet and leveled off just below the cloud deck. Flying above the clouds would have provided concealment, but it would also have eliminated his ability to navigate by ground reference, the only navigation available to him. He turned north. He needed a coastline, and he needed to find it before anyone with guns found him first. The flight north took approximately 30 minutes. He saw no Allied aircraft, possibly due to cloud cover, possibly the piece of luck his entire plan required. He saw German anti-aircraft positions on the ground, but none of them fired. An FW-190 flying at 4,000 feet on a northerly heading over German-controlled territory in April 1945 was not an unusual sight. Nobody had a particular reason to question it. When the coastline appeared ahead of him, Hoover turned west, following Lundquist's logic. Go north until you see the coast, then turn west, and eventually you will reach the Netherlands. Every minute he remained airborne was another minute in which an Allied fighter pilot or an anti-aircraft battery could acquire him. He was operating in a complete information vacuum in one of the most heavily contested airspaces in the world. The FW-190's engine temperature was within acceptable parameters. The fuel load was sufficient. The aircraft was flying smoothly despite its patched fuselage. He kept flying west along the coast at low altitude, watching the ground below for identifiable features. After approximately 60 minutes of flight, the landscape below him changed. The farms became smaller. The drainage patterns became more elaborate. The architecture in the towns took on a distinctive character. And then, through broken cloud, he saw them. Windmills. The specific and unmistakable technology of the Dutch lowlands, standing in open fields and along canal banks as they had stood for centuries. He had reached the liberated Netherlands. He began looking for a suitable field. He identified an open area behind what appeared to be Allied positions, vehicle concentrations, the patterns of military encampment visible from 4,000 feet. He had no landing checklist and had never landed an FW-190. He came in too fast and too high. He recognized both problems on final approach and made the only available decision. He deliberately ground-looped the aircraft, an intentional violent rotation that destroyed the landing gear and bled off speed through controlled structural failure. The FW-190 spun once, twice, then slid to a stop in a cloud of torn grass and metal, the propeller bent against the ground, the airframe intact. Hoover opened the canopy and climbed out. Dutch civilians had appeared at the field's edge, several carrying rifles, pointing them at the man climbing out of the German aircraft. A British Army truck was approaching along a track at the field's perimeter. Hoover walked toward it, hands visible. "I am an American," he said. "I am an American pilot." The British sergeant behind the wheel looked at the swastika-marked wreckage, then at the man in a German prison uniform. "Get in the truck," the sergeant said, "before someone shoots you." Bob Hoover got in the truck. Allied intelligence officers who interviewed Hoover in the days after his escape were initially skeptical. The story was not impossible. It was simply a sequence of events with so many variables, any one of which could have ended fatally, that its successful conclusion strained the parameters of what operational planning would consider achievable. Hoover answered their questions with the same calm specificity he had brought to Lundquist's sand diagram ground school. Yes, he had flown the aircraft with no prior time in type. Yes, he had navigated by coastline and landmark. At Stalag Luft 1, events moved quickly after Hoover's departure. Soviet forces arrived at the camp on May 2, 1945, 3 days after the escape. The 7,717 American airmen imprisoned there, along with the British, Canadian, and other Allied flyers, were not executed by their guards. The camp's German commandant negotiated a surrender agreement with Colonel Hubert Zemke that transferred administrative authority before Soviet troops arrived. The prisoners survived intact. Between May 12 and 13, 1945, Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses flew into airfields near the camp and carried the prisoners westward to Allied-controlled territory. 7,717 men who had spent months or years behind barbed wire on the Baltic coast returned to the world they had left. Colonel Spicer survived. Jerry Ennis, who had refused to fly and had left the German airfield on foot, also survived and returned home. Bob Hoover returned to the United States in November 1945. He gave no interviews. He declined to discuss the FW-190 escape with reporters or military historians. When pressed, his response was characteristically direct and consistently modest. "It was the dumbest thing I ever did," he said on more than one occasion. That formulation was not false modesty. It reflected how Hoover actually processed risk. He had made a calculation under extreme circumstances. The calculation had worked, and he was disinclined to construct a narrative around it. His superiors at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, reviewed his service record and the intelligence debrief from his escape. They saw a pilot who had demonstrated, under conditions that eliminated every safety margin, the ability to fly an unfamiliar aircraft type, navigate without instruments, manage a high-stress landing, and survive through a combination of preparation and adaptability. They assigned him to flight test duty. It was exactly the assignment he had imagined while studying Lundquist's sand diagrams in the prison compound. At Wright Field in 1947, Hoover met Captain Charles Elwood Yeager, a fighter ace from the European theater selected to pilot the experimental Bell X-1 rocket aircraft in the program designed to exceed the speed of sound. Hoover was assigned as his backup and chase pilot. On October 14, 1947, over the Mojave Desert above Muroc Field in California, Yeager flew the Bell X-1 to Mach 1.06, becoming the first human pilot to exceed the speed of sound in level flight. Hoover flew chase in a Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, documenting the flight from close range. When Yeager's aircraft pushed through the sound barrier, the sonic boom reached the ground as a single, sharp report. Hoover was close enough to see the shock wave form and dissipate on the X-1's fuselage. He had watched aviation history from the closest possible distance. The post-war career that followed was built on everything he had learned, in combat, in captivity, and in 90 minutes over occupied Europe in a stolen FW-190. He tested hundreds of aircraft types across 2 decades of the most rapid technological change in aviation history. He became North American aviation's demonstration pilot, flying aerobatic routines designed to show potential customers what the machines were capable of. His signature demonstration, flying a twin-engine Shrike Commander through loops and rolls while simultaneously pouring himself a glass of iced tea from a pitcher, became one of the most recognized performances in airshow history. General Jimmy Doolittle, who led the 1942 raid on Tokyo, called Hoover the greatest stick-and-rudder pilot who ever lived. Chuck Yeager said simply that Hoover was the best. These assessments came from men who had specific technical reasons for their conclusions. The FW-190 that he stole in April 1945 was scrapped during the post-war reconstruction of the Netherlands. No photographs of the specific aircraft exist. The physical evidence is gone. What remains is the record. A 22-year-old American pilot shot down over the Mediterranean on February 9, 1944. 16 months of captivity at Stalag Luft 1. 24 failed escape attempts. A ground school conducted in prison camp Dirt by a test pilot drawing diagrams from memory. 1 stolen Focke-Wulf FW-190. 90 minutes of flight through contested European airspace with no instruments, no maps, and no radio. A controlled crash landing in a Dutch field. And then, 50 years of aviation work that used everything those 16 months had taught him. Bob Hoover died on October 25, 2016, at the age of 94, at his home in Southern California. He had logged over 50,000 flight hours during his lifetime. He flew until very close to the end. That was the story of Bob Hoover, a man who prepared for a flight he had never taken, in an aircraft he had never touched, and made it work. History does not always offer stories this clean in their logic, but occasionally it produces a sequence of events where preparation, timing, and individual decision-making align in ways that are worth examining carefully. If you found this account useful, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one, told the same way without embellishment. Thank you for watching.